Hello, everybody. Welcome to a live stream for History Valley podcast. Today, I bring together Professor Bartosz Adamczewski and Professor Dennis MacDonald. And today, these two gentlemen join me to debate the topic, which gospel was written earlier, Matthew or Luke? And did the Q document exist? Q is a hypothetical document that is postulated to be a sayings gospel, containing the sayings found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Bartosz adheres to the Wilkie hypothesis, also known as the Matthean posteriority hypothesis, which postulates that Matthew is actually the third canonical gospel, not the second, and that the author of Matthew used Mark and Luke Acts as sources, while Dennis argues for a heavily modified form of the two-document hypothesis, which he calls it the Q plus Papias hypothesis, which states that Mark is actually familiar with Q and that Luke Acts knew Matthew and Mark, but also used Papias as a source, which Dennis believes was written between Matthew and Luke. That being said, I give the first 10 minutes to Dennis. He will give us his introductory argument. Okay, Dennis, you may begin.
Well, thank you, Jacob. I'm glad to have this chance to talk with my friend Bartosz. Bartosz and I have had meals together, and we're going to see each other again in Austria. And I have a great admiration for Bartosz's creativity and intelligence. And even though our disagreements at times can be difficult, and I expect that they will be, I doubt if that's going to tarnish our friendship and mutual admiration. So I just want to set a good example of being a good soldier in this battle. And I trust that the text is going to win in any case, and we don't have to worry about wins and losses. I think Bartosz and I would agree that the synoptic problem still hasn't been satisfactorily answered. If one says that the answer requires a widespread agreement in the guild. And the primary positions thus far have been the two-document hypothesis, which Jacob admirably summarized, and the Farrer hypothesis, advocated by people like Mark Goodacre, who argues that Q cannot be reconstructed. In fact, there should be some skepticism about whether it existed or not. In my view, I think the two-document hypothesis and the Farrer hypothesis are both wrong. And my guess is that Bartosz is going to agree with that to some extent, though he probably sides more with the Farrer hypothesis than he will with the two-document hypothesis. In any case, the two-document hypothesis early on made, in my view, two tragic missteps that meant that all of the good research that people have applied to that by that method for 100 years, much of it's quite admirable, did not produce a document that we can rely on as the synoptic source. And those two mistakes were, first, even after one tries to remove from Matthew and Luke all Mark independence, one still has 41 pericope, 41 verses, 41 pericope that are overlapping between Mark and Matthew or Luke, or the Q document and Mark. If we saw that amount of similarity between any two ancient documents, we'd say there's a relationship. And so the modified two-document hypothesis grants that. And there have been scores of scholars who have argued that Mark also knew Q. But the bigger mistake is that they insisted that the International Q Project that produced the critical edition of Q insisted that Luke did not know Matthew, and therefore one can reconstruct Q after eliminating Markan influence by assessing which is earlier, Matthew or Luke. Now, I agree with the far hypothesis that Luke knows Matthew, and this is going to be one place where Bartosz and I are going to strongly disagree, because Bartosz is going to hold to the theory that, in fact, Matthew knows Luke. My insistence that Luke knows Matthew then requires a different kind of methodology for reconstructing the lost gospel. And my methodology has really three very simple and straightforward observations. First is we find doublets in Matthew where he is redacting Mark in one case, and he has a more primitive version of the same saying somewhere else in the gospel, which indicates that he not only knows Mark, but he either knows an oral tradition with the same material, or he knows it from another document. And this material is cohesive. It also suggests that Mark also knew the Q document, which would explain the several overlaps between the two. The even more serious criterion is Luke's reversed priority to both Mark and Matthew. And here, Bartosz's material probably is going to be similar to my own. Even though, in my view, Luke is written last, he has more primitive material than you find in Mark and Matthew. Whereas Bartosz is going to suggest that Matthew knows Luke, and that would explain this phenomenon, why Luke is earlier. I would suggest that material indicates that there is a lost gospel. Such doublets and something that's called non-doublets or avoided doublets appear again over 20 times in Luke, and suggest strongly, in my view, that there must have been a lost gospel to account for these duplications. The third aspect of the Q plus Papias hypothesis is what I call social identity criticism. That is, the materials that can be isolated by means of studying these doublets and avoided doublets have a social identity which is very different from the synoptic gospels. One might say that it indicates that these materials come from Jesus, whose social situation was different from the synoptics. But I think it happens because there is a literary stratum underlying all three of the synoptics that portray Jesus as a teacher and not as the Christ or a Greek hero. The in-group has to do with disciples who are called to hardships, whereas the Gospels are a little more suspicious of the 12 and modulate how much hardship is involved with the disciples. And the outgroups are primarily Torah enforcers, namely Pharisees and legal experts, whereas in the synoptics, the main problem has to do with the Jerusalem chief priests, who are related to the temple and are responsible for the death of Jesus. Now, on the basis of all of that, it also has one more component. The Q document, as I reconstruct it, is a radical rewriting of Deuteronomy, in which Jesus is the promised prophet like Moses. And the Q document is where we first find evidence of Jesus as the Son of Man. So I find the Q document to be coherent, compelling because of these Matthean and Lucan doublets and non-doublets, and clearly the best reason for positing a lost gospel. And it takes into account the objections of the far hypothesis people, that is, that Luke knows Matthew. and therefore one has to scrub the two-document hypothesis in favor of another way of reconstructing the lost gospel. So I suppose that's almost 10 minutes, and I probably should cede to Bartosz.
Okay, Bartosz, you're up. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dennis, for presenting also the main arguments against the classical hypothesis of the Q source, which is so well taught at many universities that people even don't think that there might be something else than Mark and Q. And students are simply just taught this hypothesis as just the best solution to the synoptic problem, and they don't even think that maybe we should look for another solution to this problem. I would start with something else. I agree with you, Dennis, that what we need today is really new methodology, because the old methods of solving the synoptic problems are, in fact, ineffective. They cannot help us. How do I know it? Before analyzing the synoptic problem, I worked very much with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are two that are famous, the so-called Seref Had, the Community Rule, and the Damascus Document. In the manuscripts that we have, that we found in Qumran, in the caves, there are 5 or even 8 versions of the so-called penal code, which is contained in both writings, both the Seref, the Community Rule, and the Damascus Document. So when I try to compare them and assess their relative originality or priority and posteriority, or primitivity or development, I realized how difficult it is to state what is earlier, what is later. You have 5 versions of a given text, and you know nothing about their date, origin, or something. And how is it possible to say that this is more primitive, this is less primitive, this is earlier, this is later? I think that even lawyers, at least in my country, was famous that a law was to be passed, and then they realized that the law was somehow changed in between, and no one knew what was the original version, what was the amended version. So we have such problems in all literary texts. So it's not only a problem of the synoptic problem. That is why I say, in my opinion, such arguments that something is, for example, shorter and longer, less elaborate, more elaborate, and so on, are flawed. They are all reversible. We can imagine the reverse procedure of reworking. For example, either expanding or abbreviating, and so on. Moreover, we must reckon with the fact that later authors tried to make their writings seem more primitive. We can see it, for example, in the Acts of the Apostles. Luke was a very gifted author, and he puts various, dialects or kinds of language in the mouth of his protagonists, of the characters of the story. Some of them speak very Hebrew, some of them speak very Greek. Even Paul changes his language, his style, talking to various kinds of people. So writers like Luke were capable of imitating various kinds of style and assessing, say, originality of a given text because of the style of some fragments of it. It's really unreliable. So I started with the entirely new method, an entirely new approach. I asked myself, why do we separate the Synoptic Gospels from all other writings? This is common in academia at the universities, because even professors of the Synoptic Gospels rarely touch Paul. The professors who teach Synoptic Gospels rarely touch the Gospel of John, for example. The New Testament scholars rarely touch the Old Testament. We have the problem of specialization in our field. I try to overcome it. I work with the whole Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, and I do not exclude the Synoptic Gospels from all other writings. That is why, in order to understand the synoptic problem, I put Paul's letters into it. I know that this is a big question today, whether Luke and other evangelists knew Paul's letters. I think that yes, of course, because they were widely known in the whole Mediterranean. And it's impossible to imagine Matthew or Luke or Mark not knowing Paul's letters. They were known everywhere, even to the writers of the so-called Deuteronomy letters. So they must have been known to the evangelists. So we must reckon with the influence of Paul's letters upon the evangelists. Moreover, if we take the three Gospels, we usually exclude Acts. Why? Because people who study Acts usually study Paul, and these are not some synoptic scholars. And I think that Luke and Acts is in fact two parts of the same work. If we imagine relationships between Mark, Luke, and Matthew, we must include Acts into this whole problem, into the whole story, which is rarely done in the synoptic scholarship. So what do I suggest? Let's take Mark, which is evidently the most primitive, the shortest gospel, and almost all scholars today agree that this is the earliest gospel. Then let's take Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. And let's try to understand Matthew as a reworking, not so much of Luke, as is usually done in the synoptic problem scholarship, but let's analyze the relationship between Matthew and the Acts of the Apostles. This is much more interesting, because we may endlessly compare Matthew and Luke and say Matthew is more original, Luke is more original here and there. We will never solve the synoptic problem in this way. Moreover, what we do, we fragment the Gospels. We cut them into pericopes. None of the Gospels was written in order to be cut into small pieces, into fragments. The Gospels are literary works from the beginning to the end. What we do today, isolating pericopes, is doing harm to the Gospels. So let's take the Acts of the Apostles, let's take Matthew, and let's see the similarities. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, in the middle part of the Gospel, I'm a Catholic scholar and a Catholic professor as well. I'll always teach my students that Peter is a very important figure in the middle part of the Matthean Gospel. Why? Why precisely here? Because he's also prominent in Acts 15. So we have a first clue here to the importance of Acts, Peter in Acts, and also in the section of Peter in the Gospel of Matthew. Such are, say, general arguments. But then another thing, which is rarely observed and studied, is the first half of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew generally follows Mark, but in the first half of his Gospel, from chapter 1 to 12, he heavily reorders the Markan order of pericopes. Why? For what reason? Normally, we do not have any solution to this problem. Even Ulrich Lutz, if you follow his great commentary on Matthew, has no solution to this problem. In the second part of his Gospel, he follows Mark quite closely. But the first part of Matthew is heavily reworked in comparison to the Gospel of Matthew. Why? For what reason? I have the answer. Because Matthew tried to follow the contents of the Acts of the Apostles, and he used the Markan material in order to illustrate the flow of the story in the Acts of the Apostles. And that is why we have first a great expansion in comparison to Mark, and also reordering in comparison to Mark. So now we end with the solution that I propose. There was no Q source. No one has ever seen it. No one has ever solved the problem of the language of the source. We assume that it was Palestinian, but it must have been Greek. For example, Epiousios, Daily Bread, and so on and so on, works only in Greek. So we do not know even the language of this hypothetical source. So, using the Occam's razor, I postulate, forgetting all these things which are extra-biblical, take the works that we have in the manuscripts, compare them, Mark, then Luke and Acts, and then Matthew. And in this way, we can solve this synoptic problem. Thank you very much.
All right, Dennis, you're up. Respond to Bartosz for 10 minutes.
Okay, Bartosz, I'm going to begin with places where we agree so that we can isolate places where we disagree. I agree that certainly Luke is familiar with Pauline letters. And I wouldn't be surprised that Mark does. I find it somewhat more difficult to imagine that for Matthew. But the Pauline letters are around, and Luke obviously knows them, and they influence the Acts of the Apostles. No argument there. I also find it that I agree with you that not only Paul, but even the Acts of the Apostles is not taken as seriously as it should be by students of the synoptics. So I don't see a problem there. Yes, Peter appears in Matthew and Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, but you simply have not given us any criterion to determine which is earlier. Now, I'm going to give you 3 criteria that I use for establishing priority. One is if a saying appears independently, it's more likely earlier than one that gets incorporated into a narrative. And we know of this phenomenon, and you certainly do, the creation of crai from maxims. You begin with a saying, and then you create a narrative context for it. It was widely taught in schools, and one finds many examples of it in the Gospels. The second criterion is difficulty in a parallel is more primitive than an improvement, because scribes are more likely to move in the direction of improving a problem than in creating one. And the third one is an atypicality in a saying is more primitive than a typicality. And you've seen this many times too, when you compare 2 versions of a saying. One of them has distinctively Matthean vocabulary and the other does not. The other, more likely, is more primitive. Now, one can reverse. These are not, they're rules of thumb, but they're not laws. And I agree with you that the issue of which is earlier and which is later can be reversed and needs always to be challenged. So that the criteria that people have used in the past for primitivity don't always hold up. So that, for example, the shorter is not always the earlier. Sometimes a longer version is, and you get a truncation. What I'm missing from your presentation are 3 pieces. In addition, no, the one is what criteria do you use to determine when you have parallels between Luke, Acts, and Matthew to decide which is earlier and which is later? It's one thing to identify parallel material like Peter. It's another to have criteria to determine which one is most likely earlier, and then to justify those criteria. That's the first question. The second is, we have advantages that you don't have generally in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in that we do have external references to the synoptics in Papias. And Papias does not know Luke yet, but he knows 2 versions of Matthew, one of which likely is our Matthew. The other likely is the lost gospel that resembles Matthew, and the other is the Gospel of Mark. And your presentation of these materials ignores Papias and external witnesses. Furthermore, I would make an argument that the Q document was known into the 4th century. And the most famous story from it that circulated was the story of Jesus forgiving the sinful woman, which is still circulating in the 4th century. Ambrose and Augustine, Didymus the Blind, knows of Gospels that contain this story, one of which was the Gospel according to the Hebrews, but the other, we don't know where it came from, and I think it came from the Q document, and I'd be willing to sustain that. But we also have Papias saying that John the Elder held to these two Matthews, both in Greek, that he attributed to translation of original Hebrew. And I think that second Matthew must be, for lots of reasons we can't go into, lots of reasons must have been the Q document. But he also, Eusebius also says that Papias relies on a certain Aristion that wrote a book called Ton to Kuriou Logon Diegesis, an exposition of the logoi of the Lord. And my reconstruction of the Q document argues that its the title was Elogi Q. So I think Aristion actually wrote a commentary on the logoi of Jesus. Now that's somewhat speculative, I grant you that. But I think there's plenty of reason to say that there was a lost gospel. And I'll just end with this and wonder what you do with it. Luke's preface to his gospel says many poli have attempted to write a diegesis of the things that have happened among us. And I'm going to do one too for you, Theophilus. Now, the two document hypothesis says that those documents are only two, not many. That is, Mark and Q. The Farr hypothesis insists that the only two documents we can be sure of are Mark and Matthew. In my view, the author knows Q, Mark, Matthew, Papias, and maybe Aristion's Diegesis. So that 4 or 5 is poli, is many. Now, if you say that Luke is earlier than Matthew, I'd like to know what many gospels he has in mind, if he's just making up a number, or that because in what I understand you're saying, the only primary former gospel that he has in mind is Mark. So anyway, and the final thing is you don't mention any influence of Greek poetry. And you know that I'm a big fan of mimesis criticism and the use of the Homeric epics and in the Gospels. And I think taking that seriously, whether you buy on all my parallels or not, if you take that seriously, it really does shed new light on the synoptic problem, which, as far as I can tell, in none of the other proposals for the synoptic problem has that kind of mimesis been taken seriously. So I guess those are my issues. The criteria, Greek poetry, and external sources, such as Papias or even Luke's own preface.
All right, Bartosz, 10 minutes to counter Dennis.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dennis. We understand each other very well, and it's really great that we have so many things in common, but also some differences, and it's good for scholarship that we differ somehow from each other. As I mentioned already, the issue of the criteria of priority and posteriority is a very tricky issue. I myself use two criteria. The fact is, the first is that I try to compare entire works and not just fragments. Because, as I mentioned earlier, with the example of the penal code in the community rule and the Damascus document, we may endlessly use such criteria, and we will never know which fragment is earlier, which is later. I try to combine works. By work, I mean the Acts of the Apostles, I mean the Gospel of Matthew, and so on and so on. Not just one word or one pericope, one image, one character. Because one character or one image can always be somehow more primitive or something. So this is my first criterion. I detected 500 parallels between Acts and Matthew, which go in the same sequence. I call it sequential hypertextuality. 500 is something. It's not just comparing isolate pericopes or works. I compare the sequence, the flow of thought, the flow of ideas, concepts, words also at times, phrases, in both Acts and Matthew. And this is my first argument concerning the criteria. The second criterion that I often use, and I think for me is the best one, is that you also mentioned difficult and improvement. I only say that if we say that something is difficult, it must be not overly difficult, because if something is evidently difficult, that it can also be improved by, but it also may be an error. So I think that what suggests posteriority are little errors, little inconsistencies that are rarely observed, even by scholars. Something that seems to be smooth, but in fact it's not very smooth. Because normally if someone reworks something else, he tries to do his work well, and he does not leave great errors. So I think that if we agree that the criterion of difficulty is good, then these difficulties must be somehow minor, barely visible. So this is the question of criteria. Then, what about Luke and Papias? Of course, I think that there is some literal relationship between the two, but I postulate the reverse direction. I think that Papias knew Luke knew, and not vice versa. Again, what criteria do you have to say that Luke knew Papias and not vice versa? Evidently, there is some literal relationship, especially in the phrase Hebraidi dialect, which was never used before. I found it in TLG in the database of Greek language. Never before Luke and Papias we have this phrase in Hebrew dialect. So I think that it's so smoothly used by Luke, quite naturally used by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, and it was imitated by Papias. Moreover, you say that I do not refer to external witnesses. This is true, and this is a little bit funny to me, because I'm a Catholic scholar, and nevertheless, I use the Protestant principle, sola scriptura. I try to understand the Bible as it stands. Other scholars are Protestants, especially evangelical scholars. They try to be Protestants. Nevertheless, they heavily rely on later church tradition. So it's funny to me, because we Catholics, we are supposed to use both scripture and tradition. Nevertheless, the evangelicals, they rely on tradition more than the scripture itself. So I take the Bible, I take the New Testament, the Old Testament, and I try to understand. Of course, we know other sources as well, like Josephus, like Papias, and so on and so on. But let's try to understand scripture first, and then come to patristic writings. It's the issue of chronology. What about the logoi? We discussed it already. I think that, you know, our earlier discussion. I think that the logoi in Papias that we have are similar to the logia that he mentions, something that can be reordered. This is the so-called testimony of Papias, in which he argues, or better to say, explains the posteriority of Matthew against Mark. How is it possible that the gospel, which is apparently more primitive, is later than Mark? These two factors are contradictory to each other. And he offers, in my view, the first solution to the synoptic problem in history. He says that Mark was first, and then and the conjunction here, so, henceforth, is important, which is rarely observed by a scholar. Henceforth, Matthew used the logia of Jesus and made them in an orderly way. So I think that for Papias, the logia or logoi are fragments which can be reordered. We call them today pericopes or pericope. And I think this is his added solution to the synoptic problem that we have in history. So the logia or logoi are not so much utterances. They are rather fragments that can be reordered. Most of them are, of course, speeches, utterances, but not necessarily speeches. Then, what about the polloi that Luke mentions at the beginning of his gospel? Polloi behavior. Of course, polloi are humans. It's masculine. It's not polla evangelia or works erga, as he would if he referred to a written work. So polloi are humans. Who are these humans? I think that this is a literary convention. Now we enter another problem, Luke's indebtedness to Josephus. He follows Josephus closely, especially Josephus' rhetoric. He imitates Josephus' style of eyewitnesses and so on. I think that Luke was written in the 2nd century, so he already knew the Antiquitates Vitae, Jewish antiquities, and he imitated the style of an introduction to a great literary historiographical work. And in this way, he used these polloi as witnesses of various things, and I am the best witness because I'm the reliable witness. It's a convention, it's a style. It may refer to something historical, I think, for example, Paul's letters and Mark, but it may be simply a convention. Many people have already tried to describe these things, but now follow me, I am the reliable one. If we read the Gospel of John, we have the same rhetoric at the end of the Gospel. You may write as many books as you wish, but in fact, read my Gospel and you have the story of Jesus. And it's the end of writing these other stories or books, as John calls them at the end of his Gospel. So the rhetoric here is quite simple. Maybe John used other Gospels, and I think that he did, but it's not necessarily a statement of, say, historical fact. It's simply a conventional style. Many scholars have already discussed this synoptic problem, but the two of us, Dennis and me, we solved the problem today. And it's a conventional style that we use here in this internet form. What about mimesis? I agree with you greatly. Maybe I call it in another way. I use the modern term of hypertextuality, which was coined by Gérard Genève, French literary theorist. But in fact, we talk about the same. Free, creative reworking of something that already exists. And I traced this in the whole Bible. From the Old Testament, I also wrote 4 books on the Old Testament recently. I traced this phenomenon in the whole Bible, both the Hebrew Old Testament and in the Greek New Testament. And we have this phenomenon. The Bible is a great commentary on itself. You may call it also a midrash if you prefer the Jewish terminology. Although in our field, midrash, especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls, means something different. So I don't use the term midrash. You prefer the term mimesis because it's well rooted in ancient classical rhetoric terminology. I prefer the modern term hypertextuality because it's more general. But I think that we talk about the same. If we analyze, for example, Luke's use of Aesop fables, we agree that he was very creative in reworking also ancient literature. And here we are in the same world, so to say. I agree with you, and I envy you that you know the classical literature so well. So this is my answer, Dennis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I do want to challenge you on one piece, Jacob, if I might.
Mm-hmm.
The poli is people. Many have attempted to write a diegesis, which means that there must be multiple expositions out there. And then Luke goes on to say, and I've consulted them all. And they're a combination of eyewitness testimony and huperity to logu, the associates of the word. It seemed good to me also to write. So I do think that the opening of Luke requires us to say there are multiple books that he followed, he says, and that he's going to do the same and get the sequence right. By the way, you're entirely right about logia and papias meaning not just logoi, but in fact he says the things that are proxenta, lecthenta, the things that are done and said. So both of them are there, and they're essentially what we have as pericopes. In fact, in my work, I don't talk about pericopes, I talk about logiae for that same reason. I think the primary virtue of your work, Bartosz, is that you're opening up all kinds of questions that require a reassessment, and I don't object to that. But I'm not so convinced that you're providing a synthetic and a comprehensive solution to the synoptic problem. I think what you're identifying is all kinds of synoptic problems that other solutions have. And I think there's a virtue to that. I'm hoping that you can read my own synopsis fairly soon and come to a little more generous judgment.
Mhm.
Okay, so we're in the open dialogue phase now for the final 20 minutes. So Bartosz, what do you have? Could you respond to what Dennis just said?
Yes, of course. So first, it's a little bit a repetition, but if we talk about the holoi at the beginning, it's not the most important argument, honestly saying, and I think that you agree with me here. I think that it's a matter of convention. If you compare the opening, the introductions, the proemion, to the Gospel and to the Acts of the Apostles, with the works of Josephus, you will find the same formula and the same style, in fact. And that is why I argue that it's highly formulaic rather than a statement of facts here, especially at the beginning, because such things were conventional. The ways of opening a literary work, a historiographical work, go from Polybius and others to Josephus, Thucydides, Polybius, and to Josephus and Luke. So these ways of saying that previously there were many attempts, and now we have the best one, the reliable one, are highly formulaic. So I wouldn't put much weight to this argument, of course. What I suggest and what I do, I agree with you here, is an entirely new way of understanding the Bible and also approaching problems in the Bible. And you are right that what I do is not simply trying to analyze the synoptic problem, because I try to include in this problem all other great problems of biblical scholarship. For example, the issue of the relationship between the Luke and works and Paul's letters, the relationship between John and the synoptics. This is another huge problem in biblical scholarship, and so on and so on. The issue of the so-called Catholic epistles. What are they, in fact? Are they Pauline, anti-Pauline, and so on and so on? Then about the New Testament, the Old Testament. As I said, I just wrote 4 books about the so-called priestly source, Yahwistic source, and so on. Are they Jewish or Israelite? Northern, southern? Do they originate from Samaria, as I think, or from Judea? All these problems have been discussed for so many years, and I think that we need here new solutions. We are too much used to see problems as they were seen 50 years ago. We need a fresh approach here to all these biblical problems.
Okay, Dennis.
No, that's
Dennis.
okay. Let's hear from your viewers or from yourself, Jacob.
The viewers haven't asked any questions yet. So for the moment, I'd like you to just respond to what Bartosz said until then.
Well, Bartosz, it is true that introductions to narratives often are formulaic, but there's no parallel to Luke that is closer than what we know about Papias' in preface. And Luke, I think, knows that preface, is modeling his own preface after it. My primary reasons for thinking that Luke knows Papias and not the other way around is Luke's dependence on so much of Papias for the preface, but even more so, his alternative interpretation of the death of Judas, which you're familiar with. And if one takes the three versions of the death of Judas, the one in Matthew, the one in Papias, and the one in Luke, they almost certainly have to be arranged in that order. Any way of scrambling them in a different order seems to be such a stretch that I really don't think the case can be made. Now, people have tried to make that case. I just haven't found those cases to be successful. What do you do with what one might call the sociology of Matthew versus the sociology of Luke Acts? Luke Acts, by any reading, is more interested in the Roman Empire, in the success of the Pauline mission, and so on. But if Matthew knows Luke, let alone Acts, but even just the Lucan Gospel, Matthew's sociology is so different. His understanding of disciples' leadership is really quite different. Peter does not play an attractive role for most of the acts of the gospel. He gets redeemed to some extent at the end of the gospel, along with the other disciples. But how do you factor in sociological descriptions or evidences?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dennis. And now I think that you switch to more interesting questions, I think, because, such questions about the introduction, they are good and interesting, but maybe not for all our listeners or viewers, because they are very specialist. Now we come to the understanding of the works, the Acts of the Apostles, the Gospel of Matthew, and so on, their overall ideological aim or goal or character or something. I think that you're right, and most scholars say that it's almost impossible to suppose that Matthew knew Paul's letters. But I think it's wrong. They are very different, Matthew and Paul. Nevertheless, they have many things in common. I think that both Luke and Matthew comment upon Paul's letters. And I think that also, let's start with the Acts of the Apostles. They are a kind of commentary, especially on Galatians, how to explain the context of this provocative letter, a very controversial letter to the Galatians. So Luke explains Galatians in the like of Romans. And this disagreement, so to say, this contrast, it's not disagreement, it's contrast, we already find in Paul's letters. Such a great difference between Romans and Galatians. They are almost contradictory to each other, concerning the law, concerning the vision of the church, concerning the vision of Peter, of Jerusalem, the apostles in Jerusalem, and so on and so on. In Romans, Paul presents himself as being always in unity, or at least continuity, with the Old Testament, with Jerusalem. In Galatians, he says, no, Jerusalem, it's only sucks. It's nothing. It's a heap of ruins. The real Jerusalem is in heaven, and so on. I have never come to Jerusalem, just 2 short visits and so. So we have a great contrast already in Paul's letters. How is it possible to reconcile it? And I think that the rest of the Old Testament is an attempt to understand Paul and explain Paul. And the rest of the New Testament includes Luke, the Acts of the Apostles, the so-called Catholic epistles, in the letter of James, for example, and also the Gospel of Matthew. So they are very different, it's true, but they are no more different than is Galatians from Romans, or Romans from Galatians. In fact, what we find in Acts is an attempt to present the law and the continuity with Jerusalem. In history, I wrote a book about the historical Paul. In history, we only have 2 visits of Paul after his conversion in Jerusalem. Only 2. But Luke presents himself as visiting Jerusalem 5 times. How is it possible? Because he wanted to present Paul in continuity with Jerusalem. And in fact, Matthew has a very similar agenda. He wants to present the Pauline ideas in continuity with the Old Testament.
Okay.
We have a super chat question from Donnie Springer. Thank you for the $10. Can you both discuss the infancy narratives, i.e., motivations behind Matthew's and Luke? Matthew is clearly Mosaic, etc. Why did one author replace the others? Or did neither have an infancy narrative at that time?
Well,
Dennis,
should
for
I
me,
go first, or what?
Mhm.
Do you want to go first?
It's up to you.
No, I'll go first. Donnie, thank you for the question. It's very, very important. In my view, Luke knows the Matthean infancy narrative, and the two document hypothesis people have minimized the remarkable parallels between the two. And even though Bartosz is going to have a different orientation to which is earlier, I'm convinced that Luke rewrote Matthew's, wanted to insert the birth narrative for John the Baptist, and that he used a very famous model from a Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, in which the birth of Anchises is anticipated. And you find several different imitations in Luke's infancy narrative of that Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, such as the visitation of the angel to Mary, which is similar to Aphrodite's visitation to Aeneas and to Anchises, and promising an eternal empire, and so on. So yes, Matthew is clearly Mosaic, but Luke is clearly Greco-Roman. And Virgil uses the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite in the Aeneid to talk about the birth of Aeneas. So I think Luke is being strategically political related to the Roman Empire and a rewriting of Virgil's Aeneid right from the get-go. And it's very difficult for me to see those infancy narratives read in the opposite direction.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. I think that Donnie Springer hit the right question, because in the analysis of the synoptic problem, infancy narratives are almost neglected because they are outside the normal, say, scope of the Q source. Normally, Q scholars start the Q source somewhere at during the baptism at Jordan, or even later with the temptations and so on and so on. Here we have a real question. I wrote an article and translated this article into English. It's called "The End of Source Theories: The Genealogies in Genesis 4:5 and Their Reworking in the New Testament." It is in free access, open access, on academia, for example, academia.edu, so it can be found. And I dealt especially with the genealogies, which the genealogy in Matthew is a part of the infancy narrative. It's outside the infancy narrative in the Gospel of Luke. But if you compare the genealogies, you can see the order. First Luke and then Matthew. Luke uses the Jewish tradition. For example, in the names, they have one thing in common: the name of the great-grandfather of Jesus. It's Mattat in Luke and Mattan in Matthew. Mattat follows the overall idea of Luke because he presents the whole story of the Jewish people, including the Hasmoneans. And that is why he has, for example, Malchi and Levi. Hasmoneans were both priests and kings. And then Mattat is the Mattathias, the founder of the Hasmonean dynasty. And in these names, which follow the period between the Babylonian exile and Jesus, Luke put his own knowledge of the history of the Jewish people. So Mattat here functions very well in Luke's genealogy, whereas in Matthew, this Mattan has no role at all. This is, according to my criterion, a little error. a little improvement, or in fact, it spoiled the narrative. It has nothing to say. Moreover, the whole genealogy, 77 genealogies from Adam to Jesus, or backwards from Jesus to Adam, to Adam, they follow the so-called apocalypse of weeks, which can be found in both Ethiopian Enoch and the writings 4Q212, 4Q212, which we found in Qumran. And he follows the periodization of history into 7 periods. And we have this in the 77 generations, between Jesus and Adam and Jesus. Whereas in Matthew, it does not work at all. His division into 14 and 14 and 14 is purely artificial. In fact, it destroys the Lucan idea of presenting the history in sevens, which show the Pauline idea of the fullness of God. So here we are with the genealogies, which already show us the order. First Luke, well-rooted in Jewish traditions, and then Matthew, in fact, not understanding the Jewish traditions. In contrast to the common opinion about Matthew as being well-rooted in Moses and so on, it is true that Matthew knows the Bible, but only the Bible, only the canonical writings of the Bible. For example, Exodus. And of course, he models his story on Exodus because he wants to present Jesus in continuity with the Old Testament. But he does not know the Jewish traditions that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this shows that Luke is more original, more primitive, so to say, better rooted in Jewish traditions, where Matthew is simply a copyist who copied and spoiled the beautiful Lucan ideas.
Here's a question I have for both of you. And Dennis, I would like you to go first, and then Bartosz, you go second. Could the many sources that Luke is talking about in his preface, could that have anything to do with what Papias says that in fragment 1, if then anyone who had attended on the elders came, I asked immediately after their sayings, what Andrew or Peter said, or what was said by Philip, or by John. Hold on a second. I skipped a couple things. Or by Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the Lord's disciples, which things Aristion and the presbyter John, the disciples of the Lord, say. For I imagined that what was to be got from books was not so profitable to me as what came from the living and abiding voice. So in other words, could that be like multiple different logos from those different people that Papias just named?
No, in fact, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought up Papias that way. But he uses not the words what they wrote, but what they said. So he says that, as you said, but I'm going to paraphrase, if people came by Hierapolis, he would inquire from them what they had heard of these 7 disciples having said. And then he says, and what Aristion and the elder John are saying, using the present tense, as though they're still alive, which may be a reason for saying that Papias's evidence is very close. And what he means by a living voice is not disembodied oral tradition, but having listened from certain people that he thinks are eyewitnesses. And he wants to add some of that information into his own work, in addition to his rearranging the logia of the sources that he knows. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question exactly, but it's not that these are many things that these people wrote, but he's emphasizing these are what people are saying. And he uses several times the verb fassen, that is, they say, as evidence of an oral tradition, but not a disembodied oral tradition, but people that he's talked to, that have talked to people and heard and so on, and he wants to include that scuttlebutt in his own work. So it's not referring to multiple sources, it's referring to multiple people.
I would only add to the things that Dennis said, that the interest in naming the witnesses from earlier generation is late. It was one of the most important arguments offered by Martin Hengel in support of my hypothesis, that the Gospels with the named apostles, Matthew and John, are later than the ones attributed to less important characters, Mark and Luke. The interest in going back to the previous generation, and not just generation, but named characters and important characters, the apostles, is in fact late. This is the beginning of the church tradition that we find later in Irenaeus and others. But this is the end of the 2nd century, and not the
No. You've got that already at the end of the 1st century in Nuce. I mean, it's not developed as much as you have it later. I grant you that. But at the beginning of 1 John, John says, what we have seen and heard and handled. Now, who is the we? Presumably, it's John the Elder himself, but he is called as a presbyter. It doesn't mean that he is a presbyter or an elder in the official sense. It means he's an old fart, and he represents the old generation, and he's referring to other witnesses. So I think you have this interest in the witnesses already at the end of the 1st century, though you are quite right that it develops and it really blossoms in the 3rd century with the apocryphal Acts of Apostles and so on.
Yes, you're right. I mean the named witnesses, not just witnesses. We have this in the book of Revelation, for example, that the apostles, they are already gone, they are the foundations.
Very good.
But the interest in named witnesses with names, apostles, not just generation, is late, in fact. It's the late attribution of the Gospels of Matthew and John to the apostolic figures.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another super chat question from Myth Vision Podcast. Thank you for the $5. Great guest, Jacob. Why does each scholar think the other is wrong in their approach? I guess you can go first, Dennis, and then Bartosz second, like before.
No, I want Bartosz to go first, so I can clean up the mess.
I would say that we use different methodologies. Our starting point is different. And this is beautiful in scholarship. Dennis is well trained in classical scholarship, which I envy him, really, because we do not have such kind of studies in Poland, alas. After the communists used to tell us that everything started with their arrival on the scene of history. So classical was not important at all, the classics. So you are great with having this classical training. On the other hand, I have much more training in Jewish tradition, I mean the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I studied thoroughly, and also the Old Testament. And what I suggest is using the approach which is more general. And that is why I want to broaden the scope of the discussion, not only to the synoptic problem, but to all kinds of problems of literary reworking in the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. And in this we disagree somehow in our methodology.
I think that that's fair. I would spin it a little differently and add something. I think when it comes to the Q document, I'm much more microscopic, and Bartosz is more global and is interested in imitation and flexibility with a more open-ended and a broader canvas, whereas I'm proud that my work tends to be really incomprehensible outside of Greek, and it's really quite microscopic and detailed. So I don't know that either approach is wrong. Each one yields a different kind of payoff. But I still would, what does this scholar think that is wrong with Bartosz's approach? Just to rephrase the question. I wish that Bartosz was clearer about his criteria and more microscopic in some of his discussion. Now, ironically, in his discussion of the infancy narratives, he was very microscopic. He was talking about these little changes that happened in the genealogies, which um, I didn't see, and most scholars have not seen, I suppose. So anyway, that's my insight.
We have another super chat from Donnie Springer. Thank you for the $5. Do you think the writing of Acts is a way to write Paul into the gospel tradition as a response to a rise in Pauline theology, make it Gentile friendly?
Yes,
Dennis,
I
you
think
can go first. Yeah.
I think that's only part of the response. I think the primary response is the primary reason for writing is to create a foundational mythology for the Christian church that now is finding itself in some competition with the empire. And the very fact that Acts ends with Jesus preaching the kingdom of God entirely unhindered by Rome indicates a kind of optimism about the success of the Christian movement. And Paul becomes the primary vessel, that's the word that's used, the primary vessel to carry the message to the empire.
Mhm. Mhm. I would disagree with Donnie here, alas, because as one classical philosopher said, philosophy is Plato and some comments on Plato. I would say the same concerns Paul in the Bible, in the New Testament. The New Testament is Paul and some comments on Paul. So there is no rise in Pauline theology. In fact, the New Testament started with Paul and his theology. And all other things in the New Testament are attempts to understand Paul and to reconcile Paul, partly with himself, as I argued concerning Romans and Galatians, and also with the Old Testament. Because Christianity, as we know today, Gentile Christianity, we are all Gentile Christians, started with Paul. And all the evangelists, including Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John, they knew Paul's tradition. So there was no rise in Pauline theology. And it's not only Acts which tried to write Paul into the gospel tradition, because there was no gospel tradition independent of Paul. The only tradition that we today know is the Pauline tradition. We are not able to go back to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. We do not have the means to ask Cephas or the real James, the Lord's brother, what their views were. I argued that their views, especially the views of James, the Lord's brother, were quite similar to those of the Pharisees, for example. So we have no means to know their own views. The only things that we know is the Pauline tradition and the attempts to answer it. For example, the Ethiopic letter of James is another attempt to reconcile Paul with James. And in the Acts of the Apostles, we have the same. Apparently, Acts does not know Paul's letters. There are no Pauline letters in the Acts of the Apostles, which is strange, because Paul was mainly known for his letters. How is it possible that Luke wrote a history of Paul without his letters? But as he really often did, he gave a hint to us that Paul going to Damascus had some letters in hand. What letters? The letters to the synagogues in Damascus. So he often neglects something which is very controversial, and he leaves a hint to the intelligent readers. Aha, look here, and you will find letters, because there were letters, although I don't want to mention them, like Galatians, because they are too controversial. So I wouldn't say that Acts is a way to write Paul into the gospel tradition, because in my view, there was no gospel tradition apart from Paul. The only thing that we know about the real, say, historical Jesus passes through the letters of Paul. And all other evangelists wrote having Paul in mind. And moreover, his idea, Paul's idea, that he embodies Jesus in himself, it pleased God to reveal his son in me, says Paul. Not in some tradition, in me. I am the medium. Look at me. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. So the gospel tradition is Paul and not something that was unknown to us elsewhere.
We have another question again from Donnie Springer. Thank you for another $5. Can you discuss Marcion's gospel vis-a-vis the synoptic problem, reaction of Luke or Luke additions to Marcion's? Bartosz, I'd like you to go first on this one, and then Dennis respond.
Yeah, thank you. We already discussed it some time, in history here on this channel. I think that here really we ask the right question again. It's a new wave in scholarship to include Marcion gospel into the synoptic problem. And the question is really right, Donnie. We should ask this question. Why? Because if we date these works late to the 2nd century, as I do, I date Mark after Josephus. So Mark already goes into the 2nd century, and then later Luke, and then later Matthew. So I postulate, in agreement with the author of the commentary on Hermeneia on Acts, Richard Pervell, that Acts was written approximately 130 after Christ, and Matthew even later. Then Marcion goes here in the same time in Rome, and this is the capital of the empire and also of Christianity. And I think that Marcion is the first reaction against Judaizing Paul that Luke proposed in his Acts of the Apostles and in his Gospel as well. Luke, as to say again, he tried to explain Galatians in the eyes of the Romans, letter of the Romans. But Marcion protested against too much continuity between Paul and the Old Testament. So I think that Marcion is the first reaction against Luke, and Matthew is the first reaction against Marcion. That here we have the apostolic tradition, the Roman tradition, which says we must be in continuity with the Old Testament, and Marcion is a heretic in this field.
Well, my response is going to be so different. And as Bartosz knows, the textual problems here are so minute and detailed and difficult that certainty is probably at this point elusive, but not for me. I think I know what's going on. The Marcion's gospel is a truncation of the canonical gospel. And I think that one can show that quite clearly, that it is a very interesting and very early deviation from the canonical gospel. But it's not the earliest version of the canonical gospel. And I think one can argue, show lots of evidence for it. I'll just give you 2 examples. One is that there are hundreds of agreements between Marcion's gospel and Matthew against Luke. So how do we account for that? I think Marcion is aware of the gospel of Matthew. The Marcion's gospel is aware of the gospel of Matthew and the Western traditions of the gospel of the Acts of the gospel of Luke, and is adjusting his text of the gospel of Luke accordingly. So that's one argument. Another argument is that occasionally one finds in places where I think Luke has imitated Homer, in Marcion, Marcion's version messes it up. And I think it is secondary for that reason. There are some other examples I could mention, but it gets us so deep into Greek philology and textual criticism that I don't know that it's palatable for this medium. But Marcion's gospel is a real find. It is extremely important, and it needs to be taken consider seriously, at least in the reception of the synoptic gospels. In my view, it is a very important and early deviation from what we would call the canonical Luke, but it's not a replacement for Q, in my view.
Yes, I agree with you here, Dennis, really. I think that Donny hit the right question, and I wanted to thank him for this question.
Yeah,
Because this is really a new field in scholarship. As you said, Marcion's Gospel was normally neglected in scholarship. Now it is studied thoroughly by Marcus Vincent, and others. The problem with Marcion's Gospel is that we do not have the original of this Gospel. For the Gospels, we have the manuscripts, early manuscripts, the end of the 2nd century already, which are quite close to the originals. Whereas for the Gospel of Marcion, we only have second-hand witnesses in patristic writings, and we cannot really know how reliable they are in their transmission of Marcion's Gospel. So here we enter an entirely new world of questions. But I think that the question that Donny asked is really important, that we should reckon here with the influence of Marcion, upon the formation of the Gospels of Matthew, of Luke, Mark, and John, and also a reaction of these Gospels to Marcion's questions. And I think that, say generally, it's really, really, really important.
I think so too.
Donnie comes back with another $5 question. Thanks again. Do you think the Hellenizing, Romanizing Jesus in the gospel tradition was a pragmatic approach to avoid persecution or to complete with pagan ideas? I think he meant to spell compete.
Yeah.
Dennis, would you like to go first and then Bartosz second?
Sure. Sometimes people have interpreted my work on mimesis criticism to think that the Gospels are plagiarizing Greek literature. They're not plagiarizing it, they're competing with Greek literature to show that Jesus and in the Acts of the Apostles, the Apostle Paul and Peter and so on are better than the Greek heroes, or at least competitive with them. And for Mark and Luke, they're doing so because Virgil has already done that in the Aeneid by imitating the Homeric epics to show that Aeneas is a better hero than the Greek heroes. But there's one other piece, Donnie, that I want to make clear. They're not doing this in order to gain converts. They're doing it to fortify the Christian reader, and to say that your Jesus, identified as a Jew and tended to fulfilling Jewish scriptures and so on, and the apostles are not inferior to the heroes of the Greeks or to Aeneas. So it's a way of fortifying the believers, not a way of convincing the opponents. And if you see how this works out in the history of the reception of this literature, pagans are not interested in this literature except for Porphyry and maybe Celsus and a few others. It's the believers who are interested in this literature, and they in fact use this literature to say Jesus is cooler than Dionysus and Heracles. So I don't think it's to avoid persecution. I think it's to avoid apostasy, that Christians are leaving their churches because they find the Greek world is still quite compelling.
I would agree with Dennis here greatly. I think that you are right, Dennis, that the problems that we encounter in the New Testament are mainly inner Christian problems, and the discussions are mainly inner Christian discussions. Now I study the Acts of the Apostles. The persecutions by the Jews generally refer to the Jewish Christians in reality. So the persecutions that are presented in Acts, so Luke, so to say, it transposes the persecutions by Jewish Christians onto Jews in general. So the problems were initially inner Christian, and the problems with the outer world were much less important than we usually imagine, I think. That it's the first thing. Moreover, as I said, Jesus is portrayed in the gospel in a post-Pauline way. We have this clearly Pauline hermeneutics. Where can we find Jesus? In me, says Paul. Not in Palestine, in me. If you go to Palestine, you should embark on a ship and go there. No one does it. Only Paul with Barnabas and Titus went there, the three of them. None of the Corinthian believers, for example, went to Jerusalem. So the only Jesus whom they knew was the Jesus that was revealed in the person of Paul the Apostle. So the Hellenizing of Jesus took place already at the beginning of Pauline Christianity. Romanizing Jesus is another interesting thing, that we have some Roman elements in the Gospels which are really strange. For example, the coins, denarii. Already in Mark we found denarii, for example, in the multiplication of loaves of bread. Paying for things in denarii. It's like paying in Poland with US dollars. You may do it, but no one normally accepts in a shop buying bread US dollars for buying bread. It's another currency. It's US currency, not Polish currency. So why using denarii in Palestine? In archaeology, if you follow archaeology, if you study archaeology, there is only one or two undisputed denarii in Palestine, found in Palestine, previous to the Jewish war. So denarii were never used in Palestine before the Jewish war. We have only two examples of real denarii found. All others are prutot, half prutot, and so on and so on. Also some Tyrian coins and so on, but no Roman denarii. How is it possible that Mark uses denarii in his story? Because he wants to show that the story is already directed to the Roman audience, not simply Palestinian audience. So he makes the story of Jesus understandable to people outside the Jewish world. So such little elements, for example, another example, what does Mark do? He calls the Lake of Galilee Thalassa, which means a sea. And you know very well that it's a lake. I've been there so many times that I know it's a lake, a little lake, in fact. How to call it Thalassa, the sea, and not Limne, as Luke correctly calls it after Josephus? Because he wanted to have here a metaphor of the great Mediterranean Sea. So the people who catch the fish in the Sea of Galilee, in fact, are the people who catch the people in the Sea of the Mediterranean Sea. So he used such little elements in the story, like Roman coins, like the sea for the Lake of Galilee, to open his story to the audience outside Palestine.
Donnie Springer, thank you for the $2. Thank you both for great responses, and to Jacob. Well, Donnie, thank you for the super chats.
Thank you, Donnie, as well, for your questions.
And I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. This has been a wonderful discussion. Maybe at some point you two can get back together again on this channel.
Why not? Why not? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Jacob, for organizing our discussion, and thank you all the viewers and listeners who joined us today. It's really a fascinating issue of discussing the Bible, understanding the Bible, and I'm really glad that we can discuss it together. Thank you.
And just real quick before I play the outro, I'd like to thank the patrons and YouTube members for these are the existing people that are helping, that are patrons and YouTube members donating to the channel monthly. It helps keeps this channel going. Thanks to them. And also to the people super chatting and to the people donating through PayPal. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.